Hello, you're going to be watching a webinar entitled What is a Single Audit? This webinar is being presented by the Auditor State's Center for Audit Excellence. Throughout the webinar today, we are going to be discussing what is a single audit, when is a single audit needed, what are my responsibilities as an auditee when I have a single audit, what are the auditors going to be looking for, how will this be reported, how is this different than my normal report package looks. Then at the end of the presentation, there will be links to several resources related to single audits. The first thing we're going to discuss is how do I know when I need a single audit? So throughout this presentation, you will see references to 2 CFR 200. There's one at the top and bottom of this slide. 2 CFR 200 is where in the Code of Federal Regulations, the uniform guidance is housed. And this contains all kinds of regulations. We'll get into that more later, but those are provided to show you where exactly this guidance can be found in there so you can look it up and refer to it as needed. But this particular section of the CFR states that anytime a non-federal entity expends $750,000 or more of federal awards during their fiscal year, they must have a single audit done. And there is specific guidance out there on what all needs to be included within that single audit. The scope of your single audit will contain determining whether your schedule of expenditures of federal awards, also known as a CFA or a federal schedule, that it's been stated fairly in all material respects in relation to your financial statements. It's going to obtain an understanding of the internal controls over your federal programs, determine if you have complied with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of federal awards that may have a direct and material effect on your major programs. The auditors must follow up on any prior audit findings, and a data collection form is required to be completed and signed. We are going to get into details on a lot of those areas as we go through the presentation, but just overall, that is what a single audit entails. So, what types of federal financial assistance are out there? One thing I want to talk about before we get into these types is, even though we're using the word federal throughout this and we're talking about federal assistance, it is very possible to receive federal funds that you're not getting direct from the federal government. You can get them from the federal government. There can be a direct relationship there that you are getting federal funds from a federal agency. However, a lot of programs operate where the federal government gives the money to a state agency, and then the state agency distributes that. So the state agency is acting as a pass-through entity. We'll do an example of that. We'll say the U.S. Department of Transportation is going to provide a program for repairs to roads. That goes to the Ohio Department of Transportation. Then ODOT, through an allocation, through a competitive application program, however they have this program set up, distributes those funds down to the local entity level. So even though you're receiving those funds from ODOT, they can still be subject to single audit in their federal assistance. It is very crucial whenever you are getting any type of grant, some of the things we're going to talk about on here, to make sure you're reading carefully the requirements, the terms and conditions of this. If it's mentioning a CFDA number, if it's talking about being subject to single audit, various things in the uniform guidance applying, those can be signs that this is a federal program that is subject to being on the single audit. And you're going to want to pay attention to that because there are different requirements that may apply to this award. And you're also going to want to make sure you're keeping an eye on the amount you're expending out of those programs to see if you're going to meet that $750,000 threshold. So our first type of federal assistance is grants. I think that's the one people most commonly think of. It's the one we most commonly see here in Ohio. That's how a lot of the programs are funded. So with a grant, you are getting the money to basically operate a program, service, a specific project. They're giving you the funds towards that, and you're kind of taking the reins on that. You're operating it within the terms and conditions, the objectives of that program. A cooperative agreement differs a little bit from a grant. So on the grant, you're pretty much given the money, and the federal government's just acting as, here's our money to put out this program. When a cooperative agreement's in place, there is going to be significant involvement with both parties. So the federal government and the local entity are both going to be involved in whatever this project service may be. Next is non-cash contributions or donations of property. So some examples of non-cash contributions are donated food commodities, free rent you may receive from on a property from the government, things along those lines that people may not typically think of as federal assistance can qualify as federal assistance. Direct appropriations. This is where money has been specifically appropriated in a budget bill of some sort, of saying a certain area, even a certain entity is entitled to these funds, that we are going to give them directly to them. Loan or loan guarantees. I do want to add a word of caution on this. For it to count as federal assistance, the federal government has to be directly on the hook and responsible for that loan. So if you default on that loan, the federal government's going to be who's on the other side of that. There are several programs within Ohio where Ohio has received money from the federal government and then loans those funds out. That's how they've opted to set up their program. So if you're getting a loan from the state of Ohio, even though it might come from the federal government, the state of Ohio would be responsible in the case that there was a default. And you want to, again, make sure you're reading through the grants and the loan paperwork, all these things, to see who's directly responsible. And the last is insurance. The other thing on this, if you're reading through things and you don't know, you're not sure, it doesn't really spell out anywhere if this could be federal awards. You maybe had something before, you're now watching this training and it's making you think, oh, I might have some things that fall into this category. I don't really know where to go for my answers. First, reach out to whoever you got the award from. A lot of times they will have a contact person on some of the grant paperwork. Reach out to them and ask them that. If you don't have a direct contact like that, just go to whatever that agency is and see if you can talk to someone there. If that doesn't work, you can always reach out to your auditors. If it is an AOS audit, you can reach out to them. You can reach out to your IPA. If you still don't have any luck that route, you can always reach out to your regional chief auditor from the Auditor of State's office, and they can get you in contact with somebody. Also, at the end of this presentation will be an email address that you can reach out to that comes to the Center for Audit Excellence, and we can kind of go through our resources to see if we've had maybe some contact with someone before that we think might be able to help you. Now we're going to just briefly go over the history of a single audit. So you can see from this slide, single audits have been around since 1984. It was established because the federal government wanted to put rules and requirements in place relating to the money that was going out for the various programs that are out there. So they put out these requirements for governments that administer the federal programs, and then that's been amended. And then the following year, they put out a circular for auditors and people receiving the awards, the recipients, on how to implement the new Single Audit Act. And you can see here that that was extended to additional entity types, and then it was modified several times. As that happened, there were many other circulars, which you can see it over here. A87 is the old cost principle circular that you might have heard about before. 133 contained the audit guidance, and then there was other circulars down here. So throughout time as this progressed, there were all these circulars that were out there that applied to different entity types. So what ended up happening was a decision was made of, hey, we have a lot of different stuff out here. It's kind of getting confusing on where to go for what. We'd like to see everything be everybody be on the same page. And the uniform guidance was created. So the uniform guidance was issued in 2013. It's been updated in 2014 and 2015. And as of the date of this presentation, which is in June of 2020, it actually has some proposed revisions to it. It's going through a 5-year review, and the revisions have to go through public comment periods. They have to go through clearance at the federal government. So there will be additional changes to it, but at this point in time, we don't know exactly what those are going to be, but there will be further changes to it. The bottom line with this also is, even though there have been all these changes to the various laws on it, really what the point of the single audit has not changed, and that is just making sure that the federal funds are being properly expended. So whatever the program's terms and conditions are that they've set out there, the federal government just wants to make sure that their funds are being properly expended. All right, now we're going to talk about the uniform guidance. So this can be found, as I mentioned before, at 2 CFR 200. There is a link to the CFR here. That will just take you to the CFR page. You can type in 2 CFR 200, and it will bring up all the uniform guidance. Now, when they put this together, they decided to kind of organize it so like information was all together. And that is how they came up with these 6 subparts. Other thing worth mentioning in this is the uniform guidance for everybody. This is the guidance that federal agencies are looking at. State agencies follow this, local governments follow this, not-for-profits follow this. So there is a lot of information in here that not every single thing in the uniform guidance will necessarily apply to your situation. So I'm going to touch upon some of the sections that we do commonly find in local governments. So the first one is Subpart A. That's your acronyms and definitions. I know in the government world there's a lot of acronyms. So if you're ever reading through information, thinking about applying for something and aren't sure what an acronym means, this is a good place to go and look. Same thing with definition. If you're not quite sure what is meant by something, this is a good place you can go and at least get a starting point on what do they mean by this. The other ones I want to talk about are subparts D, E, and F. D is the post-federal award requirements. So once you've applied for and received a federal award, there are certain things that you're going to have to follow. In this subpart D, this is where it contains the procurement requirements, and it also talks about if you are going to further pass those awards on, that your entity essentially becomes the pass-through entity, and you're giving money to somebody else. Someone else maybe administers this program, not-for-profit, a different entity you're giving this money to. There are specific requirements that you have to follow for that, and those are contained in subpart D. Subpart E is the cost principles, and that, as I mentioned before, is the former A87. The cost principles are different categories of costs, and it goes through and says whether or not a cost is allowed, unallowed, or there are some circumstances where there are certain things that can make it apply. If you do this, this, and this, then you'll be okay. If those things are not done, then this cost would not be allowable. So that is a great place to look for that information. And in fact, if you are having a federal award, you definitely should be going out there and making sure that whatever you're going to expend it on, that you know exactly what the requirements are. There are some requirements that have certain things that you need to have documented, or you may need to have an additional policy in place for that. And then subpart F is where the audit requirements are housed. That contains both what our audit teams are doing and requirements for the auditee. There are certain things you're going to have to prepare, and just some different information out there on how to know when a federal cost has been expended, when you should be recognizing those things based on the type of award it is. Then finally, there are 12 appendices to the uniform guidance. Those kind of go into different details on various topics. So like I said before, if you go to 2 CFR 200 and just type it in and the whole thing's there, it will list all the appendices at the bottom. And if you wanted to go through and look and see, I know one of them, there's some more information on indirect costs. If that's something your entity is doing, there's some additional information there. Now we are going to talk about the Schedule of Federal Expenditure Requirements. You will see the abbreviation CFA here. You also may have heard of this as your federal schedule. There is kind of a wide range of things people refer to this as. And there are specific requirements that are in place that, once again, the uniform guidance will go over all of these that you need to have for your CFA. The first is you have to list the individual federal programs by the federal agency. Then if it's being passed through someone, you need to name the pass-through entity and any type of identifying number that's assigned by them. So if we think back to our kind of sample we had, so you're getting a program through ODOT who has gotten that money from the Federal Department of Transportation. So you would put Federal Department of Transportation, so U.S. Department of Transportation, then you would say pass through the Ohio Department of Transportation. Then the identifying number varies based upon the entity. For our ODOT example, ODOT's projects all have a PID number with them. So you would put down the PID number for that particular project that the federal awards were coming from. Some entities don't have pass-through numbers. Some of them have them spelled out on your award letter that you get. It will have that information on there. Some of them just say use the years. So that kind of varies. That is something that if there is not a pass-through, any type of ID number, that is also fine. That is information that you should be given on your award notifications. Then you have to provide the total federal awards expended for each individual program and the CFDA number. So then you will go through and say, this program, if it was the highway planning program, then you would put the CFDA number that's assigned to that, and then you would say $1 million were expended. The CFDA number is the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, and those numbers are all assigned by the federal government. There is a website you can go to, beta.sam.gov, and you can search for CFDA numbers, or if you don't know the CFDA number, you can put in the name of the program and it will give that number. Those are all assigned by the federal government, so everybody's using the same information. It's uniform from state to state. If you are passing those funds through to a different entity, so they are your subrecipient, you are required to put the total amount provided to the subrecipients. You would add a column that would show that information. And then the final thing you have to do is you have to provide the total expenditures for your entity overall. So it will list those headings kind of we've talked about in the total for each program. Then you'll have a grand total of all your federal expenditures at the bottom. You are required to have notes to your CFA. These are separate from your notes to your financial statements, and there are certain requirements that you have to have for your notes to the CFA. If you have any loans or loan guarantees, you are required to put the amount that's outstanding at the end of your fiscal year. You are required to include any significant accounting policies that were used in putting the CFA together. So a common one for that would be the basis that the CFA was prepared by, if it's cash basis or accrual basis. Then the final thing is you have to include a statement on whether the de minimis indirect cost rate was used. A note on this, because it's a question we get frequently, even if you do not have any indirect costs, never have had an indirect cost, never plan to have an indirect cost, you still have to include the statement that you're not using that de minimis indirect cost rate. what are the auditors going to be looking at when they come out? So we just talked about what was required for your CFA. They're going to be looking at that for a couple different things. That kind of serves as the kind of starting point for the whole single audit. They will look at your CFA to make sure it's accurate, it contains all the information we just talked about, that it's complete. So they will look through your records to see if there's anything else that maybe was a federal award that isn't included on that federal schedule. And then they'll make sure that there's supporting documentation, that it ties back to your financial statement. So they'll want to see how you came up with the information on your federal schedule. Once they're sure it's complete and accurate, then they use that to figure out what federal programs need to be tested. The programs that end up being tested are known as the major programs. And that is determined by a formula, and there are certain requirements that exist in the Uniform Guidance in Subpart F, the audit requirements, that go through and say, these are things you have to look at and makes this a program you have to test. If you only would have one program, then obviously that becomes your major program. Then after they've figured out what programs need to be tested, they will look to the Federal Office of Budget and Management, otherwise known as OMB. They annually put out a compliance supplement that provides guidance and suggested audit procedures for different areas of compliance. We'll talk more about the areas of compliance on the next slide. But they put this out, and it basically gives us kind of a boilerplate of all the information that we need to go through and ask certain questions. It tells us kind of what needs to be tested to make sure compliance with these requirements has occurred. In addition to what the federal government puts out, there may be additional requirements that are been put in place by pass-through entities, the grant award, and other forms of communication that may have occurred from whoever you've received this grant award from. Maybe they have a handbook, maybe there's some sort of portal you have to put information to, but those programs or those requirements might be housed in those. And then if it's something we think is material to the program, we would additionally take a look at those programs. Now we're going to talk about the compliance requirements. So as we just said, this is the compliance requirements that OMB has kind of set up to kind of have it in different buckets. As of today, there are 12 different compliance requirements, which are all listed on this slide. All 12 of these are not always going to be applicable to a particular program. That's why you'll go through your grant agreements. It should outline what you need to do, what's required, not required. If there is a match required, it will say in the documents that you sign when you're getting the award. Again, if you don't know if something's applicable, reach out to whoever you're getting that award from. You don't want to not be doing things, and then when it comes time for your audit, the auditors come in and ask about it, and you obviously haven't done it because you didn't know you were supposed to. So we're going to spend a little bit of time going through these different categories and giving a brief overview of what each one of those means to give you an idea of some of the different things that, if you are dealing with federal programs and grants, that you should be doing for this. On top of these specific compliance things, the auditors will be looking at the internal controls that are in place regarding these specific areas. The first one we have is activities allowed and unallowed. So that is going to be looking at if a specific cost or expenditure, if it is permitted or allowed or not permitted or allowed in accordance with the grant agreement, federal statutes, terms and conditions of various things. So they'll go out and look at the program, the documentation you have, and say, okay, this expenditure isn't allowed to occur. The next one is allowable cost principles. So these first two kind of go hand in hand. So the first one was looking at it at your specific grant side, and then the cost principles, if you think back to when we talked about the uniform guidance, there is a subpart specific to cost principles. So in that, they will go out, look at those cost principles and say, is this expenditure allowable? Cash management. There's a couple different ways that cash management can occur, and it varies the approach that auditors will have for it. So some grants are set up, they're advance funded. You will get a pot full of money every so often. It will vary by grant program. You get the money, and then you're supposed to spend that in with a specific amount of time. So on that side, we're making sure that that cash has been expended in a proper amount of time. The federal government doesn't actually have mandated time on that. It just says to minimize the amount of time between the advance and the expenditures. Various federal agencies and state agencies have put some different time caps on that. Some of them have 5 days, some of them have 30 days. I've seen 15 days on some programs. So again, you're going to want to look and make sure you're familiar with that requirement. The other way you can get cash is through reimbursements. So you incur the cost, you submit the documentation, however you go about requesting this to the federal government, they give you the money back. So on that side, it kind of goes along with, okay, we're going to make sure that the costs that have occurred, they've been allowable, they're within the time frame of the grant, and that they're actually, that they've incurred, and that you are actually going to go through with this expenditure, that you didn't submit something and it never got paid. Eligibility is next. Eligibility has a couple different ways that it can come into play in a grant award. It could be if a certain individual is eligible for award. Many grants have certain criteria to be eligible for a service. You may have to have a certain income level that you need to verify that they're at that level before you would provide any type of service to them. There also can be programs that are set up so certain groups of individuals or a certain service area is eligible. And then finally is the eligibility of subrecipients. Again, if you are going to be passing that money through, maybe you have a grant for some sort of equipment, and any entity within your county that has a fire department would be eligible to receive that. You would need to check to make sure they've met whatever requirements are in place. Equipment and real property management is next. And this has another, once again, all of these requirements you'll see always kind of have a couple different things that fall under them. If you're purchasing equipment or real property, there are requirements relating to the acquisition, the tracking of it, and the disposition. So if you're going to purchase this, there are certain things you're going to have to do when you go to buy it. There are certain things then, once you buy it, related to the records you keep on this. They want to know something to identify this is a federal asset. Some of it kind of goes along with your typical records you'd be keeping, knowing the serial numbers, tagging things. You are required to do an inventory of these assets every 2 years. And then say you fast forward 5 years, you no longer need this piece of equipment. Maybe you want to trade it in for a different piece of equipment. Maybe it's pretty much run its course and it's not really working anymore. Before you dispose of that equipment or property, there are certain rules you have to follow. And a lot of them are that you need to reach out to whoever you got this equipment from and know what their rules for disposal are. That's going to vary from program to program on how they want you to handle that. Some of them may just say, yep, we're going to give you the green light to go ahead and do this. Some of them may say you need to meet you need to do this process, you need to check off this box before we'll let you go through with that. So that is something you're going to want to keep in mind if you're buying equipment, that you're going to want to be familiar with what those rules are. Next is matching, level of effort, and earmarking. So all those are grouped together, but they're really 3 separate things. So matching That's obviously if you're required to put forth a portion for the project, the grant agreement should outline that, hey, you're going to be responsible for 25% of the cost of this, and you'll know that upfront before you get any funding. Level of effort, that can be that a certain amount of expenditures are required, a certain level of service, that there's some sort of targeted amount out there. It may say you have to provide the same amount of services as you did in the prior year. Again, these vary greatly. I know I've said it many times already to make sure that you're checking the terms and conditions and reading through those grant agreements. And then the last one is earmarking, and that is simply when there is a minimum or maximum amount that you can put towards something, a particular item. A common one we see on this is where it will say you can use up to 5% of your grant for administrative costs, or it might say you can use $100,000 of this for administrative costs. So when you see those, that's when there's an earmarking requirement in place. Period of performance. So that is the period when you can make new obligations for the fund. So the grant agreement will say you have from January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2019 to use this grant. Then it's also important to know a lot of grants also will allow for a liquidation period. So after that end of the period, say it's December 31st, they may give you 90 more days to actually finish expending those funds. So it's important to recognize what the period is and what you're allowed to do within those different periods. Procurement, suspension, and debarment is next. Procurement is when you're going to make any type of expenditure that's not payroll related, there are certain rules and requirements you have to follow, and there's different methods of doing procuring. And that is going to depend on what the amount of federal funds you're spending is. So you're going to need to go out and look at, okay, I think I'm going to spend $5,000. What category does this put me in, and what are the requirements for this? There are also requirements listed out there if you think you have a situation where you don't need to follow procurement. Maybe there's only one place you can get this from. You don't have time to procure it. There's an emergency situation. There are specific things to follow in that circumstance, so you're going to want to be aware of those. Another thing related to procurement, and I know I mentioned this before, but this is specific to procurement. One of the requirements that is in the Uniform Guidance on Procurement is you do have to have a specific procurement policy. In the section of Uniform Guidance, there are specific things that have to be included in that policy. There are some other things that will fall under these categories that also you need to have policies for. A lot of these are things that your entity may already have as just part of their standard policies, that you already have those in place, but you're definitely going to want to check on that because that will be one of the things the auditors ask to see. Then suspension and debarment is basically you have to make sure when you're spending federal dollars that you are not awarding any type of contracts to entities that have been suspended or debarred by the federal government. There is a website you can go out and check to verify that, but part of this is what is your process for making sure you're doing this. Program income. Program income is when your federal program is somehow generating income from that program. A common one with this to think of is the school lunch program. So the school lunch program gets money from the federal government. They then charge the students for that, and they are making income off things they got from the federal government. There are, again, different ways different agencies account for this. So we'll be making sure that you are valuing your program income, that it's been recorded properly, and you're using it properly. Again, this will be something that should be in the terms and conditions in your grant agreement of if you do have this situation, this is how you need to go about accounting for this. Our next category is reporting. There is a wide variety of reports out there. There are financial reports. You may just have to submit a summary of your expenditures monthly to the granting agency. There are performance reports, so they may want to know how many individuals were served under this program per month. It may be, how many jobs were created with these funds, things along those lines. So they're outside of your typical, we spent $500,000 this month. Then there can just be other things known as special reports that don't really fall into those categories, but information that either the state agency or federal agency would like to see specific information. There may be some other reports that they require you to submit that they'll want to see that they see tested. So when these are tested, there's a couple different things that we're looking at. Are they completed? So first of all, did you do the reports? Are they completed timely? So there will be, if it's a quarterly report, they'll give you the dates, and it may say, hey, we'll give you 10 days after each fiscal quarter or after each quarter to get these submitted. And are they accurate? So how did you get this information? What's the support for this? Subrecipient monitoring. This is one that you want to be aware of. If you are passing those funds through to other entities, again, there are very specific rules for what you have to do. I talked about it on the uniform guidance slide. There is a section out there that will outline exactly what you have to do. You have to set up, you will have to have a sub-award with them. So similar to the award documentation you are getting, you will have something similar set up with whoever you're granting these funds to, you're giving these funds to. And there are very specific things that are required to be in that agreement. So you'll definitely want to take a look at that. You also have to do monitoring of these subrecipients, making sure that they're complying with the terms and conditions of the agreement. Maybe you have reporting requirements that you've imposed on them. You also have to make sure if you've given them $750,000 or more, they are now subject to a single audit, and you need to make sure that they have a single audit performed. If there are issues in their single audit, you have to be aware of those and have to kind of keep an eye on some of those things. Then finally is special tests and provisions, and that is pretty much anything that doesn't fit in any of these other 11 sections that they can put out there. Hey, this is something we find is important to our program. We want to make sure that you guys look at this when you're doing your audits. Not every program has special tests and provisions. Some of them could have 10 special tests and provisions. It just depends on what information is put into the compliance supplement. Now we are going to go over the different types of reports and letters that are specific to single audit. The first thing is there will be an opinion on whether the CFA is fairly stated in all material respects to your financial statements. An opinion will be given on your CFA, and that is in relation to your financial statements. So if something is off $1 on your CFA, that's probably not going to be material to your financial statement. So that's not going to change the opinion on your CFA. There is going to be a report on compliance for each major program and a report on the internal controls over compliance. So you'll remember a few slides back when we went through all the different requirements, we mentioned that they also are going to be looking at the internal controls in place over those requirements. So they will have a report that goes through that, and then that report also includes an opinion for each major program. So if you have one major program, one opinion. If you have 3 major programs, you will have 3 different opinions out there, and those could all be different opinions for each program. Then there's going to be a schedule of findings, and the schedule of findings is going to be set up that there's a summary of auditors' results. Then there is an area for any findings related to your financial statements, GAGAS findings, and then there will be a section for any findings that are being reported specific to the single audit. The summary of audit results, we're going to go back to that, and that is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. There will be a schedule that's put in that goes over, kind of summarizes your whole audit. It will give the opinion on the financial statements. It will list your major programs. It will say what the opinion for each of those major programs is. It will say if there were any audit findings. It will list if you qualify as a low-risk auditee or not. It goes through all of that. So if someone was going to be looking at your audit report and just said, hey, I don't care about your financial statements, what they said, I don't want to look at your federal schedule, I don't want to read through all your notes, I just want to know at the end of the day, how did you do on your audit? You could hand them that schedule of findings. They would be able to go through and see kind of everything nice and neat in one page that gives them all that information. Then the final category we have here, which I lied about, I said these were all specific single audit reports. The management letter is not specific to the single audit. Many of you are probably familiar with the management letter, and just that it is items that do not meet the criteria to be reported, but auditors still want to bring those items to the attention of management. Single audit comments can also fall into the management letter category. Audit reporting. So for those opinions we talked about on the last slide, there are 4 different opinions that you could receive. Unmodified, which is your clean opinion. Qualified would be where they've found that one of those 12 compliance requirements that you were not in compliance with those. So we'll just say, for example, that you did not properly procure any of those expenditures that were made. So they would qualify the opinion over procurement. Then would go on to show that the rest of the things that were tested for that program, they were in compliance. An adverse opinion is going to be where there was several areas that had significant non-compliance. And then finally, the disclaimer, that's when we can't tell one way or another if you were in compliance. A common thing here is when there maybe the records have been lost, destroyed somehow, so we can't go back and say, hey, this was meant, or no, it wasn't meant, because the evidence isn't there to support that. When you have an audit finding, there are different categories for that. Again, here's a CFR reference where you can go and look that up. There are significant deficiencies and material weaknesses in the internal controls over your major program. There can be material noncompliance with the federal statutes, regulations, or terms and conditions of a federal award related to your major program. Then the last one is a question cost that's greater than $25,000. So when your auditors are doing your testing, there's something out there that they're saying, this just doesn't seem to fit into this program. We'll just use this as an example. We'll say alcohol, that a party was thrown and there was a bunch of alcohol there. Also not allowed under Ohio law, but that would be something that they would question and put in your report. It then becomes up to the award agency to determine what type of action. Also, with regards to question costs, if for something would come up in other audit procedures, they're looking at following prior audit finding and some of their other tests, they become aware of a potential question cost that isn't in a program they're testing, that could also be reported. Audit findings, they will be located in the schedule of findings, and they will include certain criteria. It's going to say the federal program's name and the CFDA number. It's going to list the name of the federal agency or the pass-through entity. It's going to say the specific criteria which the finding is based for. So those 12 requirements we had a few slides back, it will show which one of those areas, or areas if it applied to multiple, that this finding was found in. It will say if this is a finding that's been issued in a prior year, it will give a recommendation to prevent this from occurring again, and then there will be a spot for the entity to respond. So the views of the responsible officials of the auditee. In addition, when there are single audit findings, you are required to do a corrective action plan. You have to put together a document that's going to be outside of the schedule of findings that we just talked about that addresses each of your single audit findings. You have to provide the names of the contact responsible for the action, what the corrective action is, and what the anticipated completion date is. This has to be prepared on the auditee's letterhead. If you don't have a formal letterhead, this would just be whatever you use when you're sending out official communication from your entity. The schedule of prior year audit findings is our next item. This is another schedule that the auditee is responsible for preparing. That is going to have all the findings from the prior year, whether they're a single audit finding or were related to your financial statements. And for each finding, it's going to list whether this finding was fully corrected, if it's been partially corrected, or if it has not been corrected. It also has to include the year in which the finding originally occurred. Your auditors are going to make sure that the items that are included in that what you've said in there, that is the appropriate response. If a finding is not corrected, so it falls into partially corrected or not been corrected at all, you have to also include why it hasn't been corrected and what the plan is for getting it corrected. So what you have planned to finish correcting it, or if you have not corrected it yet, what the plan is to get it corrected. Our last area is going to be the data collection form, which this is last, and it also is something that's typically done at the end of your audit. The data collection form is a form that is on the Federal Audit Clearinghouse's website, and it's a standard form that you go through and fill out for your audit. The auditors complete part of this, and the auditees complete part of this. It is going to include all the information related to your financial and your single audit. It goes through and will ask specific questions. A lot of the information that we've already talked about in your schedule of findings. So it will have your entity's name, it will have your audit period, it will have what your opinions were, what major programs were tested. You have to go through, similar to your federal schedule, and list out each program and the amount expended. And then as part of this submission, the complete audit report package also will be uploaded. Auditees and the auditors both have certification that they will have to complete before this can be submitted. It just basically goes through and asks you some questions basically to certify these statements, I guess not questions, statements, to certify these statements related to this. The Federal Audit Clearinghouse has a great instructions that go along with this form. So if you're completing it for the first time, you'll want to go out to their website and look at the instructions. They also have a frequently asked questions page that goes through a lot of this information, and we'll kind of say, I don't know how to do this, or what should I be putting here, and it has all that information. If you have issues when you're going to submit this, or you have additional questions that you can't find in there, they are great at getting back to you. On their website, it has their telephone number and it also has their email address, so you definitely could reach out to them for any questions. Now we are at the resources page. So a lot of these resources are things that we've talked about already, but we just wanted to put them at the end to have everything together in one spot and also give you links to where you can find this. The uniform guidance, we've talked about this several times, but this is another link that will take you out to the guidance. The uniform guidance frequently asked questions. When the uniform guidance first came out, there was a lot of questions being asked. So they decided to put all of those questions they were getting into a document and put it online. It's set up so when you're looking at your uniform guidance in your 2 CFR 200, it's set up the questions, the section numbers, and how they have the questions set up go hand in hand. So if you go out and look and you're like, I have a question related to this particular cost principle, we'll say, for example, it's 2 CFR 415. If you go out and look in the facts and you find that, it will list any questions related to that section. There is a lot of good information out there. So if you have a question, you'll definitely want to take a look. There's a chance that maybe already has been answered. These were last updated in July of 2017. The Federal Office of Management and Budget, this is a link to their website. That is where you can find the compliance supplement that we talked about earlier that your auditors are using. If you want to go out and look at that and get a better idea of what they're going to be testing, what they're going to be looking at, to kind of prepare, make sure you have the right information. Also, a lot of the information they have on there, it has links to different guidance that the agencies may have out related to these programs. So it can kind of be a good tool for on the auditee side of things to just get information you might not have been aware of was out there. The Federal Audit Clearinghouse, for the data collection form we just talked about, here's a link to their website. Again, you can get the instructions, see their FAQs. This is where you'll need to go to submit your form. The AICPA Government Audit Quality Center, this is a portion of the AICPA's website that is specific to government things. They have a lot of articles relating to government things. Also, single audit issues are out there. They have some tools, different forms that you could use for various sections if that's something that interests you. And then finally, we have our auditor state website. Many of the items that we talked about in these links are also found on our website. We also have shells for many of the things related to single audit. We have a specific area of our website for those. The federal schedule, there's a template for that. There's a template for notes for some of the reports. If you want to see, hey, what's exactly this report going to look like? All of those things can be found on our website. We have now reached the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time. Here is the email address I had mentioned earlier. If you have any questions about this presentation, information that was obtained in this, you can reach us at facker@ohioauditor.gov. That is an email address that is manned by somebody, so we will respond to that or get your question to the appropriate person that may be able to assist with that as soon as possible. Thank you and have a great day.